today. First of all, I'd like to welcome you all to our Critical Collaboration Workshop series. This has been a series of webinars that we began last December. This is the fifth one. Some of them are on video on the CCTE, Cal Council for Teacher Education YouTube channel. And we invite you to go look at some of those past ones that we had some wonderful speakers and sessions there. I'm Eric Engdahl. I'm president of CCTE and chair of the Department of Teacher Education at Cal State East Bay. Just real quickly, we'll go over the agenda for today. Brief welcome, then I'm going to turn it over to Linda Blanton to do the overview. And then I believe it's Lynn Larson who will be discussing the Blackboard course. Then, of course, we will have our speaker, Dr. Alfredo Artiles. And then there will be a breakout room discussion and closing. So, Linda, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you.
Thank you, Eric. I am Linda Blanton.
Council on Teacher Education YouTube channel.
Oh,
I'm Eric Engdahl.
Someone has pulled up the YouTube channel.
Okay, I'll start again. I'm Linda Blanton, Cedar, University of Florida. For those of you who wonder what CEDAR means, Collaboration for Effective Educator Development, Accountability, and Reform, a national center in partnership among University of Florida, American Institutes for Research, and the Council of Chief State School Officers. The mission is there for you to see, and to achieve this mission, CEDAR works with states, I believe it's 25 at present, to establish and enhance partnerships among state departments, IHEs, school districts, and other stakeholders. To achieve that mission too, it's really critical to align all of those partners in assuring outcomes, positive outcomes for students who struggle in schools. There are many, many resources on the website, and I urge you, if you have not, to use the website to see what is there. With that, I'll turn it back to you, Eric, or to Lynn. I'm excited to be here today and to hear Alfredo. Dr. Artiles.
Hi, everyone. So I just wanted to highlight the great, wonderful group of faculty and staff who have been involved with this critical collaboration workshop series. If you want to just flip back to that slide for just a second. Perfect, thank you. So you've already heard from Dr. Linda Blanton and Dr. Engdahl. We also have Dr. Amy Hanreddy, who is from Cal State Northridge, Dr. Rebecca Jez from University of San Diego, Dr. Sarah Juarez from Cal Poly Pomona, myself, I'm from Bremen University, and then we've had just fabulous support from Kate Adams, who is CEDAR staff. So now you can flip ahead to the Blackboard course sites. Something unique for this particular workshop series, webinar series, is that we have a repository of information and activities you can participate in related to the speakers that have participated in this series. And we have that set up on the Blackboard course sites. And we have an action plan that you can fill out and a reflective activity for this particular workshop. And we have some incentives available for those who participate in those activities. We'll put you in a drawing for a $50 gift card. And you can access all of the prior speakers' materials in that Blackboard course sites. And I'll put the link in the chat and you can access it and sign up for it. It's free registration. If you have any difficulties registering for the site, just provide me your email and a private message and I'll get you signed up for the site. And that site will remain open through the end of the summer, and then Blackboard course sites is apparently going away. So that's when that site will be shut down, I believe the end of August. So we would love to see you participate in our activities in our Blackboard course shell. Thank you.
Eric?
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought, Rebecca, you were doing this. My apologies. So it is with great pleasure that we have Dr. Alfredo Artiles with us today. He is the Jacks Professor of Education, and I don't particularly need to read a PowerPoint slide to you. I always feel that's a little redundant. But he has done extensive work and is well known for his work. And I really want to, I'm looking forward to hearing him speak. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to him.
Thank you, Eric. Can you hear me? I hope sound is
Yes.
okay. Yeah. I'm going to share my screen so you have access to my slides. Let's see. Can you see the slides? Yeah, okay, good. Well, thank you again for this invitation. I am grateful to, of course, Dr. Engdahl, as well as Dr. Rebecca Jess, who extended the invitation. I see many friends on the screen. I missed some of you, but I saw Linda and Vicky and Sharon and Maya and others. It's good to see you all. I appreciate also the invitation from the organizers of the Critical Collaboration Workshop Series and Cedar Center. That continues to do important, influential work in this area. And I'm grateful for this opportunity to share some of my thinking and work with you about this very complex, long-standing issue that have impacted the field. I hope everyone is well and safe as we enter, hopefully, a more stable situation for all of us after a very long, difficult time in the last 18 months. What I would like to do is to focus on this issue of racial disparities in special education. It's been hotly debated, particularly increasingly polarized in the last few years. And I want to bring forth the argument of the dual nature of disability as a way of framing this problem in a new way. And by the dual nature of disability, I'm going to say more about it. But let me just say quickly that I think about disability as a universal category. It is a notion with which every human being engages with at some point in their lives in one way or another. It touches all of us at some point. And it is not then surprising that societies advance protections, responses, entitlements to people who suffer one way or another from a disability. And so in that way, it's an object of protection. But at the same time, we have multiple examples throughout the history of humankind that also disability can be used as a tool of stratification and exclusion. And therein lies the dual nature of disability as something that helps us protect, but also marginalize and exclude. And that creates a number of paradoxes. So I want to focus on this. Now, the bottom line for me in the discussion is, as we frame this perspective of the dual nature of disability to engage the problem of racial disparities, what I'm concerned with mostly at the end is how do we avoid dehumanizing those whom we were seeking to represent in our work, and especially in our research, and hopefully find ways of acknowledging in our work the social, historical, and the cultural context of these individuals. We have to be reminded that we all occupy very specific locations in society. We inhabit hierarchies that are constructed by history and by ourselves. And those experiences bring consequences to our lives. And so we need to place the discussion about racial disparities in the location that race and disability have in our communities and in the history of education. And how do we think about the complex lives people have across multiple communities because of those hierarchies and the demands that we receive as professionals, as researchers, as practitioners, that certain ideologies that are floating in the work we do in institutions and in society force us, compel us to ignore these complexities. And I will say more about that throughout my talk today. So in the end, I guess what I'm trying to say is that there is a moral dimension to the work that we do that is connected to some of these ideas. And so my goal today is twofold. I want to challenge all of us to take a critical look at the way in which this long-standing equity problem has been framed, the racialization of disability. And second, reflect on the implications of this reframing for the work that we do. Let's see if I can get this to move. Doesn't seem to be moving. There. All right, so quickly, disproportionality has been defined along these lines. To what extent membership in a particular group affects your probability to be placed in special ed? What is interesting about this is that certain categories of disabilities, the so-called low incidence, in which the problem is observable outside of the school context and is typically diagnosed by medical professionals, we don't see a significant problem with the racialization of disabilities. In some cases, despite the high level of poverty that affect many marginalized communities that tend to have a strong connection to disability, we don't see the problem of racial disproportionality in many of them. And so this situation creates, as I was saying a minute ago, these paradoxes that raises this question: how is it that special education, which was created to respond to inequities to people, for people with disabilities, become an index of inequality for other marginalized groups? How is it that the civil rights struggle and educational struggle for people with disabilities might be now becoming something that excludes others? That's at the heart of this problem. In other words, how, as we engage with this predicament, how do we preserve and enhance those equity achievements that attained for students with disabilities without undermining educational opportunities for other groups? That is the heart of the problem. This is not whether there is a problem. It is not whether teachers are racist. It is not whether this predictor has more weight than his other predictor. The reality is that the problem is well and alive, and it is affecting many students in many regions of the country beyond the debate that we have witnessed. So back to the idea of the dual nature of disability. I'm going to give you a few seconds to read that quote, getting at the point that I made a couple of minutes ago, so I'm not going to spend much more time on that. But the bottom line is that it's this idea of the dual nature of disability is a neglected consideration in the analysis and the responses to this problem. Now, if we think that disability then can have either positive or negative consequences, the challenge for us as educators, as researchers, as policymakers, as leaders, is what Ruha Benjamin, a sociologist from Princeton, addressed in the context of race and technology. So it's a slightly different context, but it applies really well to this issue. She argued that we need to show how, by whom, under what conditions, and to what ends symbolic categories like disability and race are made real in the lives of individuals and in the workings of institutions alike. When disability serves stratifying functions, where it happens, for whom, under what conditions, and with what consequences. That is the challenge. How can we work to make special education increasingly responsive to other forms of difference that intersect with disability? It's all about a situated analysis, in other words, for those in research activities. Just to give you an example around issues of crime and race, to stress the point of situated analysis. And I quote from a publication by Brooks. On April 1, 2010, 44% of low-income Black men from the Watts neighborhood of central Los Angeles were incarcerated. But just 6.2% of the men who grew up with similar incomes in central Compton were incarcerated on that day. Central Compton is 2.3 miles from Watts. So I think that quote makes the point rather compellingly, that it is about understanding the local circumstances In the meantime, we have to be reminded that we are living in a time in which there is unprecedented diversity in the schools. Many contexts are now minority majority. And at the same time, the last 25, 30 years, we have seen a growth in the spread of inequities across multiple domains: education, income, health, labor, housing, etc. And significantly for all of us, there's been a condoning of color blindness in recent time in society as well as in research circles. And there is evidence to that. So I'm going to speak to that on this point. So that's the social and historical context in which we're actually looking at this problem. We cannot ignore that surrounding reality. And in the meantime, in our field, we have seen an increasing oversimplification of the problems, mostly framed in terms of binary questions that tend to erase complexity and context. Is there disproportionality? Is the problem over or under representation? Are teachers or principals racist? That kind of binary logic is really propelling an emphasis on deficit logic that tends to blame communities of color. And in the process, we have seen a biological reinscriptions of race. Just as we know that race is a social construction, there is no genetic biological basis to race. It is a very real category, of course. But as we begin to see the litany of things that some scholars are raising that these individuals, these students, these communities suffer from, related to biological conditions, connected to lead painting and low birth weight, and the list goes on and on. And the list is presented in a vacuum as if those things are not connected to long-standing social inequalities. We just end up reinscribing a biological lens on the experiences of those individuals. This is highly problematic because it's only polarizing us. It's not helping us advance our understanding of this problem. And for that reason, it is critical that we begin to reframe this work. Here's the core argument of my presentation today. We need to think about the racialization of disability from a historical perspective. We need to use historical imagination. And at the same time, we need to acknowledge the significant role of socio-cultural and contextual influences in this problem, something that we haven't done enough in examining this problem. So here's my plan. I'm going to do a couple of things. I'm going to historicize the problem as a beginning attempt to get into this reframing. And I'm going to argue that history matters because it has a structural dimension to it, and because there is an important consideration on the history of the intersections of race with disability. So those two things are going to help me put this context in a historical perspective so that we have to bring that imagination of history to bear. And second, I'm going to argue that there are certain ideologies of how we conceptualize competence that we tend to ignore in their study and responses to this problem. And within that, I'm going to bring up as quickly as I can so I can cover all the information, that this is not a purely technical diagnostic precision issue, that there are things happening that have been documented that reminds us that that technicality that we want to infuse in this discussion is not enough. Of course, methodological rigor is critical. We're lacking theoretical formulations of the problem, that a lot of the work is atheoretical. But when you look at the fact that there has been resistance to this problem, not only in the research community, but around the states, it reminds us that there is some ideological component attached to this beyond predictive models and technical accuracy. When you see the persistence of this racial script that presents communities of colors as broken people, as the only way of describing them, you begin to wonder what else is happening here from an ideological perspective. And when you see the work, the subtle and consequential work of what I describe as defect craft, the process by which we erase difference to reproduce difference, And we do that in a number of really important ways, and I'll speak to that in a minute. When you see all of those things, you have to be reminded that ideological issues, as much as we like to think that we should not engage with them in the research community, are there and mediate a lot of the things we do. So, historical imagination, from a structural perspective, there is a wealth of evidence from economy and sociology and history that there are structural inequalities that affect the experiences of people. Let me see if I can go into this website to make this point. This is a beautiful data visualization that was published from a study by Chetty and his group a few months ago, representing the comparison between white boys with black boys that are coming from wealthy families. I hope you can see that. Give me a thumbs up that you can see it so I know. Okay, good. So what is happening here is that most white boys, the yellow squares, raised in wealthy families will stay rich or upper middle class as adults. This is a longitudinal analysis. But black boys raised in similar rich households will not. So you see black boys, the blue dots, how they are increasingly going to the lower strata of this distribution. So it's one way of thinking about this tension we have seen in this debate. Is it race? Is it poverty? Is it social class? And of course, social class matters. Of course, social class and poverty affect child development. That's not the argument, but the point is that race has a unique contribution to this, and we cannot lose sight of that to really fully understand the complexities of this issue. You get the gist. And that applies to other areas: criminal justice, employment, wealth accumulation, etc. So there is plenty evidence showing the intergenerational aggregation and compounding of economic and social disadvantages. That obviously will have an impact on a number of other areas and domains, including educational opportunity. However, attention to opportunity, lack of opportunity, opportunity gaps has not been taken up in this research for the most part. And we have to be reminded also that what we know about racial inequality, our racial common sense, is shaped not only by facts, but by a framework produced through a complex network of social interactions, of official knowledge, media images, embedded stereotypes, and so forth. And if we ignore these historical legacies, we tend to naturalize this possession. We tend to think that certain communities are poor, less advanced, less accomplished because of something they lack. The reality is that those disadvantages spill over education and educational opportunity. There was an important class action suit in California. Those of you who live in California remember the Williams class action suit. It was a stark reminder of the importance of social context. The case was filed by the ACLU against the state of California in 2000 because of the terrible conditions in many of its public schools. What Michelle Fine and Ruggles called the circuits of dispossession that forced the miseducation of students of color. So the argument I'm making is that those structural inequalities have a significant impact in the education of students of color and actually produce the miseducation, as Michelle Fine will say. And I'm quoting from her report from the Williams class action suit. She said, remember that schools are intimate places where youth construct identities, build a sense of self, read how society views them, develop the capacity to sustain relations, and forge skills to initiate change. These are contexts where youth can grow or they can shrink. And so as part of the evidence used in the case, Michelle Fine conducted focus groups and interviews with youth to document their educational experiences. And here is a quote from her report, one of the quotes. Many students spoke of the lacks that their education has instilled in them, as if they embody the inferiority of their schooling. Here is Jamie's statement, a 10th grader. I'm going to give you a few seconds to read it. So there are significant implications for the experiences of students of color. How much of the outcomes we track over time are shaped by these structural inequalities? How do we account for that? If we just say that is achievement, that because students of color have a lower achievement, they belong in special ed. Those of you who have PhDs in special education know that low achievement doesn't mean necessarily disability. There are many potential confounding factors in that, yet we have not engaged with these issues. So structural legacies, historical legacies, this didn't happen 10 years ago, it's been happening for generations. In addition, from a historical perspective, I argue that we have to be reminded that disability has been entangled with race for a long time. We tend to think about these problems as starting in the field by the recognition that Lloyd Dunn did in 1968 in that article on exceptional children. Well, yes, but that was not the beginning. If you think about the historical record, we find evidence dating back to 18th century at least of how disability was entangled with race. One example is the work of Schweik from Berkeley, a historian and disability studies scholar, documenting ugly laws. These were policies and laws that restricted the access to public spaces to people who looked disabled because they had physical issues or sensory issues, sometimes intellectual disabilities. Oftentimes, many of these people were African American and members of other racialized groups. And as you see there, these laws peaked in the 1890s, just when segregation in the South was getting to the top, when immigration law excluded people with mental and physical defects, and the eugenics movement was gaining strength. So we see these precursors of race and disability already there. Now, don't think this is 18th century stuff. The last few ugly laws were abolished in the 1970s, right around IDEA. Where does this stuff go? Do we just assume that because it happened a few years ago and is abolished, they don't exist? How do they find their way to current life, to attitudes, to predispositions? In the meantime, since at least the 19th century, public health and other disciplines, including medicine, psychology, and education, have engaged with the notion of race in oftentimes problematic ways, oftentimes with ethical consequences. Nancy Krieger gives us this example in her widely cited book on public health. She said, racial categories become so entrenched and naturalized in scientific thought that by early to mid 19th century, medical discussion about populations and research on their health status without racial categories became virtually unimaginable. So we have a long tradition of this comparative research that can be useful, but it can also be framed very problematically if we're not aware of the ideologies and the historical legacies of this connection between race and disability. Because guess what? What happens in a lot of those comparative studies is that students of color, communities of color, are inferior to white communities. One after other study shows the superiority of those communities. That's problematic because it's just giving us a very limited slice of those individuals and communities with very clear deficit perspectives informing the design of the studies. Now, in addition to that, historians of disability have also reminded us that not only has it been considered justifiable to treat disabled people unequally, there is a long-standing legacy of that. But the concept of disability has been used to justify discrimination against other groups by attributing disability to them. So all of this is in the background of engaging the idea of racial disparities. This is not happening in a vacuum. This is not a technical issue of better or worse statistical models. Again, rigor is critical to do the work, but there is a historical sedimentation. There is a philosophical background to understand what it means to have a disability, what it means to be a member of a racial minority group. So, structural historical legacies, race disability historical entanglements, we cannot afford to ignore them. Let's just stop, let's pause for a moment. We'll bring these questions back maybe for the latter part of the meeting today. But let's just think about, and I think Rebecca will share these questions once I move on. But let's just think about the way in which structural historical legacies and the role of racial frames and colorblindness can have a role in this. And here are some questions that come to mind. Given all of the historical legacy that I mentioned, how is it that the literature on disproportionality is silenced about it? How do you make sense of that? People are not accounting for that. Now, given that there are circuits of dispossession, how can you expose those in your teacher education programs? How can we raise and understand the miseducation of students of color and how they contribute to racial disparities? How can you take into account these dispossessions in professional development programs? How can you interrogate and address the roles of structural and intersectional histories in racial disparities? How do we use the responses to these questions to change the curriculum in teacher ed? To look at the curriculum in K-12 education, to think about pedagogy and assessment in new ways, to design clinical experiences in ways that will engage with these realities. So those are some of the questions we need to be thinking about. The second point beyond the historical legacies I wanted to mention is this idea of ideologies, of how we construct the notion of competence and incompetence. And what I would like to do is, again, challenge this so-called technical view of disproportionality, that we need to go beyond diagnostic accuracy and raceless visions of the problem. And I'm going to allude to three things. I'm going to mention that if it's just an issue of technical considerations, why is it that we see in multiple contexts a great deal of resistance to disproportionality, even in light of the presence of the problem? Then we'll challenge this idea of how we use the ideology of color blindness to maintain a vision of the very nature of students of color, their ontology, as damaged. And three, to challenge this technical view, I will bring up this idea of defect craft, the process by which we often erase difference to reproduce difference. So resistance. It is interesting to see that we have regulations and prescriptions from IDEA to monitor and address disproportionality. But look at this data from the different states, showing at the top in the blue portion of the dials, the number of times in that state that is required to be identified for special ed to count a significant disproportionality. Mind you, the federal policy doesn't define what counts as significant disproportionality. Each state does that. So Louisiana, Maryland requires that students of color or whatever group is represented at least twice. Rhode Island, 2.5. Nebraska, 3 times. Alaska, 3.5, etc. But that's not enough. I mean, we're talking about 300 and 400% in the case of Pennsylvania. But you have to show that how many times? Well, in Maryland and Louisiana, you see the bottom of the dials in red. 1 year is enough. But in Rhode Island, you have to do it. And Nebraska, you have to show 2 years in a row, that pattern. And in other states, you have at least 3 years in a row. So you have to be documenting this over and over. Why is this resistance? Why do states keep moving up and down the threshold for disproportionality? What are the legacies of racial inequalities in those states? And how have they impacted educational opportunity? Do we have any evidence, historical evidence of how race and disability have been entangled in those? What processes contribute to those bureaucracies to change those definitions of disproportionality? Taking advantage of the latitude to set their own criteria to determine disproportionality, each year, only about half of all states identify any district as disproportionate, or only about 2% of all districts, despite persistent widespread findings of disproportionality in scholarship and federal reports. So you have states that might have 3 times as likely to be placed in special ed, but they're not cited because their definition says that it has to be 3.5, or the definition says you have to be 3 years in a row to count as significant. So it's an interesting exercise in denying the problem and resisting the problem. And what happens is that typically we see the work of color blindness, which is moving to the second point of my discussion of ideology. Color blindness is pervasive. We can say color evasiveness if we don't agree with the term, but we have to remember that it's well and alive. It's a meta frame that includes multiple racial scripts. And the logic of this ideology follows this path. First, it is framed as an individual actor point or issue or problem. The argument is racism is reduced to intentional acts of bigoted individuals. That's the way it's refined in the ideology of colorblindness. The next move is to say we deny it that it exists because there are so few of those people now that racism has lost significance. We can find them, we just don't see them. Where is the evidence that these people had the intentional act to do that? And if that's how I define it, then it must not be here. And what is the answer? The third move in that logic, we scapegoat culture. We say if we see inequalities, if we see racial disparities, it is the product of culturally deficient bodies. It must be their fault. That's the way we begin to build this circuit of moving from the ideology of colorblind, denying the presence of this issue, to make assumptions about the very nature of the communities that we blame, the ontology that they have. And so we create this circuit of ideological assumptions. And as Cheryl Harris says, then racial inequality will only disappear when you follow this logic, when Black people are fixed. Highly problematic. We just finished a study in the Northeast of districts, suburban districts, chronically cited for disproportionality. These were districts that came in and out of citation status over a period of 10 years. So we are beyond the debate of whether there is disproportionality or not, whether this is happening or not. They are cited. They have been cited a number of times. And what we're finding is that we already have a paper published, another one under review, 2 under review. There was a history of racial tensions and white flight that shape how leaders and practitioners explain the problem and how they responded to the citations. This was a district next to a center city's urban district. The suburban Lakeview, these are student names, all of them, was mostly white, was in the top 10 highly achieving districts in the state. They had a history of white flight, but they had been showing very good results over the years. But they had a lot of movement from the city center that was mostly low-income African-American. And that created a lot of issues. And over time, that issue of disproportionality became reality. And as we started to interview people, we saw that there were tensions around race dating back to the 60s. Not only in the school district, superintendents tried to integrate schools that were fired because of that. There were tensions in the community connected to racial segregation and so forth. So all of this was in the air, and it was very much not included in any reports or acknowledgements. There was talk about family in the district. We are a family, we love each other, we do a lot of things. But in the subtle discussions of family, it was clear that some groups were not included in that vision. So by broadening the analytic scope to understand the surrounding communities and understand how race was playing a role in the lives of these individuals, we began to see how the context of those histories began to do that. And one of the direct implications of that was the pervasiveness of a deep deficit discourse. Here's a quote from one of the teachers. They had a very negative discourse and understanding of especially African-American community. When a lot of the urban creeps started and we were seeing a lot of kids coming from the city, they will come into our classes and they couldn't keep up. And this stance permeated the visions of district leaders as well as professionals. Not everybody, but a majority of them. There was also critical engagement with the problem of race in the district. There were special education teachers and leaders fighting the problem of racial disparities. But in terms of the pervasive pattern, this was the pattern, a pattern of damaged bodies, and the argument that we have high expectations and those kids come with very low expectations and they cannot keep up with us. It was interesting also to begin to see the work of defect craft, how differences were erased. So superintendents or districts or principals will say, data are data. I don't look at race. Data are race neutral. I just tally the discipline problems or the identification processes, and that's it. We're just applying the rules, and I don't see race. So we're erasing those differences. But at the same time, they said, but race matters because these kids are not ready. They just can't keep up with us. They don't care. They're not motivated, and they don't have the skills to function. Two moves within the same beat. Race doesn't matter, but race matters. And it is interesting to see when you track how race becomes visible at different points in time in the general education to special education process. Race is visible and invisible at different points. Sometimes practitioners might claim we don't see race, like in general education or during referrals. Sometimes it becomes invisible during the assessment process, eventually becomes visible again when kids are placed in special ed and you have to monitor by race by Monday. What is the work that we do when we erase race in a particular set of practices and we make it invisible the next step? In the end, we end up redefining racial disparities. What work are we doing by denying the importance and centrality of race? Those are questions we need to be asking, because what we're doing is that we make race raceless in that process, despite the fact that race has a central dimension in the life of every citizen in the US, whether you take up the notion of race or not. Many things are organized around race. So let's pause again for a minute and think about this. What are the implications of this? Is there resistance to engage with this problem at your program, at your teacher education program, at your school? What ideologies might mediate that resistance? Or if you do engage it, what are the ideologies that permeate your engagement? What is the framing that is being used to discuss students of color? And if it's about people who are broken, lacking, dangerous, or disposable, can you disrupt that, and how? Are differences being erased at your school? For what purposes? So those are some of the things, and you can look at the curriculum, assessment, clinical experiences, pedagogy to answer all of those questions. So this is beyond bad apples. This is beyond individual races. This is about ideology and history. So let me wrap it up. There are a number of things we can consider. We can think about, how do we represent the problem? Can we create alternative representations of this? For example, can we find out in which context are students competent at what they do? And where do they appear incompetent? Can we examine questions like what counts as being disabled, who gets the label, and what are the consequences? Can we bring a language of possibility? If we look at the lived experiences of students, which is something we don't do enough in schools and universities, And then we find points in our practice in which we're engaging in defect craft work, where students tend to come up as not apt or competent. What happens if you juxtapose those lived experiences with those instances of defect craft? Can we be critical and reflexive about the nature of the knowledge we use in teacher education and professional development? How we read and use those texts to look at how history is acknowledged, the intersectional histories, the structural histories, the role of ideology. How do we promote and nurture epistemic reflexivity in our programs? Do we know anything about the community's histories in which we work, of how race has been engaged and how race has been entangled with disabilities, how we use that information? Do we care? Do we document it? So those are some of the ideas that we can begin to explore in our respective work. And there you have it, the 2 points with the specific sub issues. I'm going to leave my email in the next slide. So if you want to follow up with me, I think we have some time for a comment, for comments and questions. I have a recent blog where I address some of these issues. In case you're interested, you can go to that link. And I'm happy to stay engaged with you over time. And I appreciate your engagement and attention. So thank you so much. I'm not sure who's going to lead the conversation here, but I'll wait for the.
Thank you for that. That was really wonderful. And for those of you who want to dive deeper into this, I just want to remind you that Alfredo is going to be one of our keynotes at the CCTE conference upcoming in October. So I for one am very excited to dive in deeper when October rolls around.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. If you have any questions, either put them in the chat or raise your hand and we'll try to monitor those. I'm not seeing any questions coming in the chat. You brought us all into side here. This is from Sima Solanovic. What are your thoughts on the reverse disproportionality we see in high status disabilities?
Tell me more, Sim, about reverse disproportionality. What do you mean? And what is high status disability?
Sima, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Thank you. So kind of the high dyslexia, ADHD, autism, where white children are disproportionately over-identified. They're seen as kind of more socially desirable disabilities, and they are treated in more inclusive classroom settings, whereas you have a disproportionate number of Black and Latino students, specifically Black, who are often identified for less socially desirable, kind of low status disabilities like intellectual disabilities and behavioral disabilities.
Thank you for that. Yes, it's happening. It's been happening for a long time. We have seen that in different categories. People have mentioned it in the context of autism. And back in the 70s, when Larry P was passed for IQ testing, we saw a bit of that, how a migration from intellectual disabilities to learning disabilities, right? I think it's a way of using social capital, is my reading of it. Parents use their social capital to get access to services. Systems can play that role. Sometimes they don't. I think we all try to use those resources for the benefit of our kids. Sometimes it's racially motivated, sometimes it's not. I just pasted a link to a very interesting study by Tom Skurdik and Argan Satsioglu in the American Sociological Review. They show exactly what you're talking about. I think it came out in 2019. They showed that white parents moved to what used to be considered a lower status category in the district. So in a way, it's countering this pattern you're mentioning. But then they mobilize political will and resources to move the resources to the low status category as they move to that category. And they did a longitudinal analysis of that. Fascinating. It's just fascinating how we, as I said at the beginning of my talk, you see people, communities mobilizing resources to create hierarchies. And it is our job, leaders, to keep asking questions about that, to ensure that we have equity and moral responses to what we do on the table, because it will happen. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but those are the things that come to mind.
No, that's fascinating. And that's exactly what I was talking about. Thank you so much for that article.
Yeah.
And I see a question from Amber Lee. Do you want to unmute yourself? Amber, she asks.
Oh yeah, no, I got it. Now, how do you engage, like you talked about engaging pre-service teachers, but how do we engage teachers that have been teaching for so long on this type of culture, historical, structural reflection? Yeah, it just seems as if there's never a place where we can transition from one way of doing something to another, because there's always someone from the old guard in place.
Right. It's a very complex question. It's the question about how to change practice. Do we change people's minds, or do we change institutions? We tend to present it in that way. And the short answer is, I don't know. So here is what I will say. There is interesting developments in educational research using, as we know, research practice partnerships that has not addressed, for the most part, disability and race, but is showing a mechanism over time to engage in this kind of questioning and using design-oriented approaches to inform and influence practice, to begin to engage with this question that you raised, which I think is critical. And what happens is that rather than going to talk to practitioners who've been in the field for a long time, remember, this is not out of will. This is not, for the most part. I don't think this is people trying to damage kids. I think it's the role of ideology and history. Of course, there are people who have really horrible beliefs and values about this, but a lot of times it's invisible, it's unintentional, it's unconscious. I'm not justifying people, but I think it happens. And I think we need to tackle the whole breadth of options that cause this problem. So as you engage people in the analysis of their own practice, we have multiple iterations of that in teacher education over the years. But I'm hopeful that the research practice partnerships offer an interesting opportunity. It didn't pay attention to equity questions early on. I've seen in the last 5 years more attention in the literature about taking up equity questions in these discussions and making it a central part of the work of those partnerships. There is also work on formative interventions that are informed by cultural psychology. That it's sort of the same concept. You bring teams of researchers and professionals to look at a problem that the professionals defined and gather data over time to engage. There has been work around discipline disparities in Wisconsin that Aiden Ball has done in the last 8 to 10 years. There is research published on that. So that offers a beginning of an answer to your question, that professionals, when they are engaged and are given the tools they can begin to move in the direction of answering questions and adopting an ethical stance to the work they do. There will be people that will not do it. And my perspective as a leader is you work with the people that are ready. If you don't have the leadership of the school or the district on board, it's going to be very unlikely that it will happen. And you also have to do the work knowing that some people will not follow and engage with you. That's part of the tension that you have to deal with, but it's a reality. So I think those two areas are promising to me. So I'm not sure if that answers the question.
Yes, thank you.
Rosemary, Ren, I'm gonna, why don't you unmute and ask your question? And I think this will have to be our last question for now before we go into our breakout groups.
Yeah, thank you. One of the things I've noticed is that there's a narrative projected in our textbooks and policies that projects a deficit mentality and approach to special education. I mean, it's packed with it. And I'm wondering, I know a lot of it's outdated, but it kind of goes with what the prior question was, is how do we shift the vocabulary to reflect the current understandings of students and disabilities?
Yeah, that's a critical question. I think disability is an interesting case of identity politics. You know, a lot of the legislation and the advances made in special education were based very much in an identity politics approach to attain civil rights. And there are people in disability studies, for example, arguing that the challenge for disability is that it doesn't have the same resources and tools that other groups in society have to advance discussions of identity in different ways because of the pervasive conceptualization of disability in society. There is disability pride movements, there is attention to those issues, but for the most part, these people argue that it's going to be hard to advance that discourse because of the nature of the condition. I think, you know, there is discussion about normality and what counts as normal, et cetera. We have seen over the years about that. I think the exclusive focus on impairments and what is lacking in the experiences of individuals is part of the conversation here. So that's why advancing a language of possibility to call attention to other things, we presumably do that in special education by looking at strengths and weaknesses. Well, we err on the side of the latter. We err on the side of restricting kids to very narrow understanding of their profiles without taking into account what happens in more informal contexts. There is an interesting development in the learning sciences now to understand learning in informal contexts and what happens in other settings beyond classrooms and schools that might give us some light to what people can do and add multidimensional considerations of what they can accomplish in different contexts. So it's a difficult question. I think attention to the language of possibility is going to give us one opportunity to engage that. And by asking the question that you ask, by engaging in this conversation, you begin to change the discussion and the discourse.
I'm going to take my prerogative and continue with questions to you, if you don't mind. We're having some really rich questions coming through the chat. Teresa Huerta, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Yes. So how does language bilingualism, in particular here in California, where over 45% of the population speaks another language, how does that play in regards to special education? Do you see any trends there going on?
Thank you, Teresa, for that question. I do see a huge role. It's been with us for a long time. It tends to be hidden in the discussion because race has played such a dominant role in disparities in special education. If we only keep the discussion at the aggregate level, at the national level, Latinx and English learners do not show a disproportionate placement. But if you go down to the state level, the way you just did, or district level or regional level, you see a very different picture. Immigration is another dimension. We actually did a study 15 years ago in California showing the disproportionate number of students with disabilities who were English learners. And there was an interesting category in those districts. We had a large sample in that study, and we found a couple of things that were interesting, 3 things. The disproportionality was more evident at the middle school and particularly at the high school level. That was probably the precursor of the long-term English learner discussion. It was not as prevalent at the time, but we saw that these were this was the group that was most overrepresented. One of the journal reviewers actually raised the question, well, maybe these kids are just newcomers, they've been in the country for too little, and that's why they end up in special ed and so forth. And we actually went back to the data and showed that these were not newcomers, that they have been in the system for a long time. Second point from the study, the district categorized students as having proficiency in their first language, but not proficiency in English, one group. The second group didn't have proficiency in the first or the second language. They had no language, according to the district. They gave proficiency tests in the first language and second, they came out as not being proficient. Unless you have a severe language impairment, it's very unlikely that that will be the case. So it might be an assessment artifact. From a linguistic perspective, it's described as semi-lingualism. It's been debated since the 70s in linguistics. It's a problematic notion, but the district was using. And as I go around the country, talk to people, it is a category that is well and alive. Many districts make this distinction, that there are many of these kids that are not proficient in either language. That group was the most vulnerable in terms of risk for special ed identification. And it's a puzzle. We have hardly any research on this group. And the third thing is that we found an inverse relationship between wealth or level of poverty in the school and risk for English learner identification. So English learners had a higher chance to be placed in special ed in wealthier schools. What is that about? I don't know, but the pattern was clear, especially in learning disabilities. So there is attention to some of these issues, and I think we need to do more research about that. We are beginning to do work, going back to the earlier question about changing practice. We're doing a youth participatory work in Central California, starting in the fall in a high school, working with artists from the San Francisco Art Institute to empower the youth to create representations using arts and humanities tools about their experiences with discipline disparities. Most of these kids are English learners and special education, both. And what we want them to do is to find a way to communicate what it feels like, what it is like to be at the school and live under the policies and the rules of discipline that is creating inequalities. And then once they do that, we'll bring those representations. And I don't know what is that going to be. Anywhere between a poem to a survey to a sculpture, who knows what they're going to come up with. And we're going to put those in front of the leadership of the school. And we're going to engage for 6 months with the administration of the school to put in conversation the official data on discipline with the work and representations of the youth, and use that conversation as a mechanism to restructure the policies and the discipline codes of the school, taking into account those. It's not going to be an easy conversation, but we're approaching it as a formative intervention project. We'll invite parents as well to be in the room. And there is a small group of African Americans in that district that is more affected by this issue. We're going to have the representation as well. But it's one way of engaging. This is a way of addressing this issue of second language and race around disability.
As an arts educator, I'm going to follow that one very closely. I'm very
Thank
interested
you.
in that one. Amy, I'm going to give you a chance to have the last question before we break into small groups.
I wasn't sure if I should ask it due to time, but thank you. This is a continuation of a conversation that started at the CEDAR convening earlier this week. And so I thought I would throw it out to you, Dr. Artiles. So my question is, what are your thoughts on models or frameworks that kind of overlap or connect high leverage or evidence-based practices kind of together with culturally responsive teaching? Do you feel like these dilute or water down the emphasis on race and language within our instruction, or does it strengthen the connection between those two frameworks?
In principle, I will imagine that will strengthen the work. It will depend on how you integrate that. There are some challenges in doing that work. And I think part of the answer should be to use what we have shown that provides significant impact for the learning trajectories of kids, and ask to what extent are we accounting for issues of language and ethnic differences that will enrich and supplement that work. Part of the problem we have is that when we look at the research produced, and my colleagues and I and others have done really careful reviews of research published over 30, 40 years in, say, learning disabilities, the attention to these issues, as you know, Amy, is very little. Even in the most superficial way of reporting ethnicity in the samples of the studies, there is hardly any attention to those really basic considerations, let alone the design of the intervention. So I think in principle, it should be a good avenue for us to consider strengthening the work that we do. The theoretical assumptions and how we integrate attention to the role of culture in human development is critical. That's part of the big gap in this work, that we have very limited understanding of the way culture influences human development. There is a lively knowledge base on that we haven't used systematically in special education. So I think we need to spend careful time analyzing, because we tend to use this discussion mostly as a demographic marker conversation. How do you take into account? And then we end up oftentimes stereotyping the role ethnicity and culture and race influences learning. And that's deeply problematic. It's not sustained by research and theory around human development. So I guess it's a qualified yes that I give you as an answer, that we need to think about that in careful ways. But there are, the beauty of this integration of interdisciplinary teams that can provide, because it's going to be very hard for all of us to have the expertise required to do this. You need those teams. Hey, Bruce, I didn't know you were going to be here.
Yeah, I didn't know I was going to be here either. I had another meeting that ended early, so I had a direct conflict. But I just following up on that last point, I was really interested in understanding why you think it is the case that race and language issues has been so not the focus, and has been even to the extent of not even reporting the data in many of the studies. Like, do you have a theory about why that is? Because I have some notions, but you've been thinking about this longer and more deeply than I have. And, you know, I guess it would be easy to do corrective maneuvers to address it, but understanding why is that? I mean, do you think there's the ethos of like colorblindness, or we're studying things that theoretically would be dangerous to try to associate with race? Or, you know, maybe the researchers themselves felt disempowered or unprepared to take on the issue of race. And even in some of my own research that I've been involved in, we ended up studying this construct of socioeconomic status. And we felt like we had a pass because we didn't have to dive into these controversial racial issues that we didn't feel equipped to deal with, but we could move forth in the science of, you know, just kind of a bleached out socioeconomic index.
Right. So I will say there are multiple reasons for that. One important one is the fact that we are socialized to ignore race and other forms of difference. So color blindness is a significant influence in that. The second thing is that we are taught as researchers to be objective and to stay detached. And the moment you begin to engage with some of these things, especially, it's changing now, I think in the last 10, 15 years, but for many years, the moment you begin to engage with those, it might be perceived by some as engaging in things that are removing you from scientific activity in some quarters. So you're supposed to be objective, and you're supposed to just apply this. And the idea is that the universality of experiences of certain groups should be applicable or generalizable to others. And if you do your duty in terms of random sampling, you should be okay. I think that that might be a part of this issue, and which is astounding, because one of the first things you learn as a graduate student is you describe your samples well. You need to go provide enough information to replicate the work. And yet we found over and over that researchers tend to ignore that and don't report the details of their samples. So it's really intriguing to me. But I think the way you organize doctoral programs for many years, I think, again, is changing. We stay away from these topics. I mean, when I was going through my PhD program, we didn't have enough attention to this. It began to change eventually, but so we don't have the comfort and the theoretical grounding to understand how these things happen. And this is not an act of political correctness. This is not an act of activism. It's an act of understanding human development as a cultural endeavor. And we haven't done enough in understanding that we now have the science to begin to see that connection in more systematic ways.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. I am going to have to move to our final activity for this, but I really want to thank you on behalf of everyone here. This has been just a very inspiring visit with you and talk. And so thank you. I really appreciate that.
Thank you, Eric.
Rebecca, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you. Okay, if you can just wait to join the groups, I'm just going to go over our next part. We've put together, and I'm just going to put it in the chat right now, a Google form to kind of summarize some of the topics that we've gone over in the different critical collaboration workshops that we've had. And so if you want to click on that, we will ask for your email, and that is so that we can put you in a drawing for a $50 Amazon gift card. One of the intentions of this workshop series was to also recognize that we're all busy. And so if we could also give back to education, then that would be a nice thing. So we have the different prompts there, and we're going to move into groups where we can talk a bit more about this talk, along with some of the other ideas that have come up in this different series. So if you would please move into your breakout groups, that would be great. And Kate, can you throw me into mine again?